January 30th, 1933. In a smoke-filled room in Berlin, an Austrian corporal with a strange mustache raised his right hand and took an oath as Chancellor of Germany. Within 8 years, this man would command the most powerful military machine Europe had ever seen, conquer nations that had stood for centuries, and bring the entire continent to its knees. Adolf Hitler's war machine didn't appear overnight. It was built brick by brick, tank by tank, lie by lie, through the most audacious rearmament program in modern history, violating every treaty, deceiving every ally, and preparing for a war that would consume 50 million lives. This is the true story of how Nazi Germany planned to conquer Europe from 1933 to 1941, and how one man's twisted vision transformed a defeated nation into a killing machine that nearly succeeded. When Hitler became Chancellor in January 1933, Germany was not supposed to have an army worth mentioning. The Treaty of Versailles had stripped Germany of its military might after World War I. The German army was limited to 100,000 men, no tanks, no military aircraft, no submarines, and a navy restricted to 6 battleships of less than 10,000 tons each. The treaty was designed to ensure Germany could never threaten Europe again. But Hitler had other plans. From his very first day in power, he began secretly preparing for war. The groundwork had actually been laid before Hitler even took office. In 1932, the German government under the Weimar Republic had already adopted the Second Armament Program, a plan to expand the army to 21 divisions at a cost of 484 million Reichsmarks. This was technically illegal under Versailles, but it was done quietly, disguised as defensive preparation. Hitler seized on this program and supercharged it beyond recognition. Hitler's first move was to hide the money trail. He appointed Hjalmar Schacht, a brilliant but morally flexible economist, as president of the Reichsbank. Schacht created dummy companies, the most notorious being MEFO, which issued special promissory notes called MEFO bills. These were essentially government IOUs that could be exchanged for cash, allowing Germany to fund massive rearmament without the transactions appearing in official budgets where foreign powers might notice them. Through this financial sleight of hand, billions of Reichsmarks flowed into weapons production while the international community remained largely oblivious. The scale of deception was breathtaking. In 1933, Hitler ordered German generals to triple the army to 300,000 troops. He ordered the Air Ministry to build 1,000 warplanes. This was done in complete secrecy for 2 years. Factories that were supposedly producing tractors were actually manufacturing tank components. Aviation clubs that claimed to be teaching sport flying were training combat pilots. Shipyards that were building merchant vessels were designing U-boat submarines. Behind closed doors, Hitler revealed his true intentions to his inner circle. In a secret speech to military commanders on February 10, 1939, he explained that every decision since 1933 had been part of a master plan. The withdrawal from the League of Nations in October 1933, the remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, the annexation of Austria in 1938, all of it was calculated steps toward war. Hitler told his generals that he had known from the very beginning that Germany would need to rearm, to remilitarize the Rhineland, to expand eastward. The only question had been timing. By March 1935, Hitler felt confident enough to publicly reveal what he had been doing in secret. On March 16th, he announced to the world that Germany had rebuilt its air force, the Luftwaffe, and would reinstate conscription to create an army of over 500,000 men. This was a direct and open violation of the Treaty of Versailles. The world's reaction should have been immediate military intervention. Instead, Britain, France, Italy, and the League of Nations issued statements condemning Hitler's actions, but did essentially nothing to stop him. This moment was crucial because it showed Hitler that the democracies lacked the will to enforce the treaty. Their statements were hollow. Britain even rewarded Hitler's treaty violations by signing the Anglo-German Naval Agreement in June 1935, just 3 months after Hitler's announcement. This agreement allowed Germany to build a navy up to 35% the size of Britain's surface fleet and have equal submarine tonnage. It completely contradicted the Versailles Treaty, and it sent a message to Hitler that Britain was willing to accommodate his expansion. France was paralyzed by political instability and wouldn't act without British support. The policy of appeasement had begun. Hitler interpreted this weakness as permission to accelerate his plans. In 1936, Hitler launched the four-year plan under Hermann Göring. The plan's stated purpose was to prepare Germany for self-sufficiency and war readiness within 4 years, from 1936 to 1940. Göring was given dictatorial powers over the German economy, able to make laws simply by publishing decrees. He established the Reichswerk, an industrial conglomerate focused on mining and steel production. The goal was autarky, economic self-sufficiency, so Germany wouldn't depend on imports during wartime. Hitler's secret memorandum for the four-year plan, written in his own hand, revealed the apocalyptic nature of his thinking. He wrote that a showdown with Russia was inevitable, that the world was moving toward a final conflict between Judeo-Bolshevism and German National Socialism. He demanded total rearmament regardless of economic costs. The German economy was being transformed into a war economy, and the entire nation was being mobilized for conquest. By 1937, Germany had quietly built one of the most formidable military forces in Europe. The German army now had 36 divisions. The Luftwaffe had become possibly the most experienced air force in the world after gaining combat experience in the Spanish Civil War. The Kriegsmarine was building submarines and battleships at an accelerating pace. But Hitler wasn't satisfied with just having weapons. He needed to test them, to train his forces in real combat, and to begin his territorial expansion. Spain provided the perfect testing ground. When civil war broke out in Spain in 1936, Hitler sent the Condor Legion, an expeditionary force of German aircraft, pilots, and ground troops to support Francisco Franco's nationalists. The Luftwaffe practiced bombing tactics that would later be used across Europe. They famously destroyed the town of Guernica, an atrocity immortalized in Picasso's painting, but more importantly for Hitler's purposes, a successful demonstration of terror bombing. Meanwhile, Hitler had been carefully studying which nations he could conquer without triggering a wider war. His first target was Austria. In March 1938, German troops crossed into Austria and annexed the country in what became known as the Anschluss. The Austrian chancellor had planned a referendum on independence, but Hitler pressured him to cancel it and resign. German forces entered Austria without firing a shot, greeted by cheering crowds in many areas. 6.7 million Austrians were absorbed into the Greater German Reich. Hitler had gained territory, population, and resources without war. He had also learned that neither Britain nor France would intervene to stop him. His next target was Czechoslovakia, specifically the Sudetenland, a border region with a significant ethnic German population. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, threatening war if his demands weren't met. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich in September 1938 for a conference with Hitler, French Premier Édouard Daladier, and Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. Neither Czechoslovakia nor the Soviet Union, despite having a treaty with Czechoslovakia, were invited. The result was the Munich Agreement, which handed the Sudetenland to Germany in exchange for Hitler's promise that this would be his final territorial demand. Chamberlain returned to Britain declaring he had achieved peace for our time. Within 6 months, Hitler broke that promise. In March 1939, German forces invaded and occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, dismantling the country and creating a puppet state in Slovakia while annexing Bohemia and Moravia into the Reich. This was the moment when it became undeniable that Hitler's ambitions weren't limited to uniting ethnic Germans. He was conquering non-Germanic peoples, creating an empire. Britain and France finally realized that appeasement had failed. They issued guarantees to Poland, promising to declare war if Germany invaded Polish territory. Hitler didn't believe them. He had watched them betray Czechoslovakia and do nothing when he remilitarized the Rhineland. He gambled that they would back down again. But first, he needed to neutralize the Soviet threat. In August 1939, the world was shocked when Nazi Germany and Communist Soviet Union, supposedly mortal ideological enemies, signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression agreement. The pact contained a secret protocol that divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence, essentially agreeing to partition Poland between them. With the Soviet Union neutralized, Hitler was ready to strike. September 1st, 1939. At 4:45 a.m., the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, supposedly making a courtesy visit to the free city of Danzig, opened fire on Polish fortifications at Westerplatte. Simultaneously, 1.5 million German troops poured across the Polish border from the north, south, and west. The invasion of Poland showcased a new form of warfare that would become synonymous with German military might. Blitzkrieg, lightning war. The strategy combined fast-moving armored units, mechanized infantry, and overwhelming air support to break through enemy lines, encircle defenders, and create chaos before the enemy could organize an effective response. The Luftwaffe destroyed much of the Polish Air Force in the first days, gaining air superiority that allowed Stuka dive bombers to terrorize Polish troops with their infamous sirens. German panzer tanks raced hundreds of miles ahead of infantry, cutting supply lines and communication networks. The Polish army, though brave and numbering about 1 million men, was catastrophically outmatched. Their strategic planning was outdated. They tried to defend the entire border rather than falling back to more defensible positions. Their equipment was obsolete. They had cavalry units charging German tanks. They had no answer to the coordinated air and ground assault. By September 8th, German troops reached the outskirts of Warsaw. On September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded from the east, sealing Poland's fate. Warsaw surrendered on September 28th. By October 5th, the last Polish forces had capitulated. Poland was divided between Germany and the Soviet Union exactly as the secret protocol had specified. Britain and France had declared war on Germany on September 3rd, honoring their guarantee to Poland, but they did nothing to actually help. The period from September 1939 to April 1940 became known as the Phony War. British and French forces sat behind the Maginot Line, a series of fortifications along the French-German border, while Germany consolidated its hold on Poland. Hitler hoped Britain and France might still negotiate peace now that Poland was defeated. He was genuinely surprised that they had declared war at all. But as months passed without any meaningful Allied offensive, Hitler realized they lacked the will to attack. He turned his attention westward. In April 1940, Germany launched simultaneous invasions of Denmark and Norway in Operation Weserübung. Denmark fell in hours. Norway resisted for 2 months before surrendering. Germany now controlled Scandinavian ports and access to Swedish iron ore, critical for steel production. Then came the main event. On May 10, 1940, Germany invaded France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. The attack was brilliantly planned. While the Allies expected a repeat of World War I with Germany attacking through Belgium, Hitler's generals proposed sending the main panzer thrust through the Ardennes forest, a region considered impassable for tanks. The French had left this area lightly defended, believing the forest was a natural barrier. German armor emerged from the Ardennes and raced to the English Channel, cutting off British and French forces in Belgium. The Allied armies were encircled. Within 6 weeks, France, which had withstood 4 years of German assault in World War I, collapsed completely. British forces evacuated from Dunkirk, abandoning their equipment. Italy joined the war on Germany's side. France signed an armistice on June 22, 1940, in the same railway car where Germany had surrendered in 1918. Hitler had avenged the humiliation of Versailles. Northern France was placed under German military occupation. Southern France became a puppet regime based in Vichy. Hitler stood in Paris, posing for photographs at the Eiffel Tower. He had conquered in weeks what Kaiser Wilhelm's armies couldn't conquer in years. The only Western European power still fighting was Britain, now isolated and alone. Hitler expected Britain to negotiate peace. Instead, Winston Churchill, who had replaced Chamberlain as prime minister, declared that Britain would fight on. Hitler ordered preparations for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Britain. But first, Germany needed air superiority. The Battle of Britain began in July 1940 as the Luftwaffe attempted to destroy the Royal Air Force and break British morale through bombing. The British, fighting over their own territory with radar technology and determined pilots, inflicted heavy losses on German aircraft. By September, Hitler realized that invading Britain was impossible without air superiority. He He postponed Operation Barbarossa indefinitely and turned the Luftwaffe to terror bombing of London and other cities in what became known as the Blitz. British cities burned, thousands of civilians died, but Britain didn't surrender. Hitler had suffered his first strategic defeat. Unable to conquer Britain, Hitler turned his attention to where he had always intended to strike, the Soviet Union. Everything Hitler had done since taking power had been building toward this moment. In his worldview, Germany needed Lebensraum, living space in the East. The Slavic peoples were subhuman in Nazi racial ideology, suitable only for enslavement. The Soviet Union represented Judeo-Bolshevism, Hitler's ultimate ideological enemy. The fertile farmlands of Ukraine, the oil fields of the Caucasus, the mineral resources of the Urals, all of this would fuel the German Empire for 1,000 years. The Nazi-Soviet pact had always been temporary in Hitler's mind, a tactical necessity. Now, with Western Europe conquered, he was ready to fulfill his ultimate ambition. On December 18, 1940, Hitler signed Directive 21, ordering the invasion of the Soviet Union. The operation was code-named Barbarossa after the medieval Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, who sought to establish German dominance in Europe. The scale of Barbarossa was unprecedented. Germany assembled over 3 million troops, the largest invasion force in history. They had 3,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 2,500 aircraft. The plan called for 3 massive army groups to strike simultaneously. Army Group North would drive toward Leningrad. Army Group Center would aim for Moscow. Army Group South would conquer Ukraine. Hitler and his generals believed they could defeat the Soviet Union in 2 to 3 months. They assumed the Red Army, weakened by Stalin's purges of military officers in the late 1930s, would collapse like France had. They planned for a Blitzkrieg campaign that would reach a line from Archangel in the north to Astrakhan on the Caspian Sea. They were catastrophically wrong about how quick and easy it would be. In the early morning hours of June 22, 1941, without any declaration of war, German forces crossed the Soviet border. 3.8 million Axis troops, including Romanian, Hungarian, Italian, and Finnish units, attacked along an 1,800-mile front. It was the largest military operation in human history. Initially, everything went according to plan. Soviet forces were caught completely by surprise. Stalin had received intelligence warnings about the attack, but refused to believe Hitler would invade while still fighting Britain. He thought the German buildup was a negotiating tactic. When the invasion began, Stalin was so shocked he reportedly went into a depression for several days. The Red Army was in terrible condition. Stalin's purges had executed or imprisoned over 25,000 senior officers. Those who remained were terrified of making decisions without Stalin's approval. The army had been ordered to triple in size, but this meant officer positions were filled by inexperienced men, many without formal military training. German forces achieved spectacular encirclements in the opening weeks. At Białystok and Minsk, they trapped and captured hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. At Kiev, in the largest encirclement in history, they captured nearly 700,000 soldiers from 4 Soviet armies. German panzer units raced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. The Luftwaffe destroyed thousands of Soviet aircraft, many caught on the ground. By late July, German forces had advanced over 400 miles and were only 200 miles from Moscow. Victory seemed inevitable. But then the advance began to slow. Hitler and his generals disagreed on strategy. The generals wanted to drive straight for Moscow, the Soviet capital and transportation hub. Hitler insisted on diverting forces south to capture Ukraine's agricultural and industrial resources. This argument consumed precious weeks. Meanwhile, Soviet resistance stiffened. Unlike the French, the Soviets didn't collapse. They retreated, they took massive casualties, but they kept fighting. Soviet factories were being relocated east of the Ural Mountains, beyond German reach. New armies were being raised from the vast Soviet population. The harsh Soviet winter was approaching, and the German army wasn't prepared. German troops wore summer uniforms. Their vehicles lacked antifreeze. Their weapons froze in the extreme cold. By October, when the drive on Moscow finally resumed, autumn rains turned roads to mud, bogging down tanks and trucks. In November, temperatures plunged below freezing. German forces reached the suburbs of Moscow in December, close enough to see the Kremlin towers through binoculars. But they could advance no further. On December 5, 1941, the Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive. Fresh Siberian divisions, equipped for winter warfare, drove the Germans back over 200 miles. It was Hitler's first major defeat on land. The failure of Barbarossa was the turning point of World War II. Hitler had gambled everything on a quick victory. Instead, Germany was now locked in a war of attrition with the Soviet Union, fighting on a front that stretched thousands of miles, consuming men and resources at an unsustainable rate. The Wehrmacht had lost over 830,000 casualties by the end of 1941. The war was far from over. Operation Barbarossa had opened the Eastern Front, which would become the deadliest theater in human history. Over the next 4 years, more than 26 million Soviet citizens would die. 82% of all German military casualties would occur in the East. The industrialized slaughter of the Holocaust accelerated in the occupied Soviet territories. Millions of Soviet prisoners of war were deliberately starved or worked to death. Entire cities would be reduced to rubble. But in December 1941, Hitler's war machine, which had seemed invincible, had been stopped. The plan to conquer Europe had reached its limit. Hitler would never fully recover from this strategic blunder. From the moment Hitler took power in January 1933 to the launching of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, Nazi Germany had transformed from a defeated nation restricted by treaty into the dominant military power in Europe. Through deception, rearmament, diplomatic manipulation, and ruthless aggression, Hitler had conquered or allied with most of the continent. Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, France, Yugoslavia, Greece, all had fallen. Only Britain remained undefeated in the West, and now Germany faced the vast Soviet Union in the East. The war machine Hitler built was technologically advanced, tactically innovative, and initially unstoppable. Blitzkrieg tactics had revolutionized warfare. But the machine was built on lies, financed through unsustainable debt, and driven by an ideology of racial hatred that guaranteed eventual destruction. The plan to conquer Europe had been audacious, methodical, and nearly successful. But Hitler's greatest mistake was invading the Soviet Union before defeating Britain, opening a two-front war that Germany couldn't win. The war would continue for 4 more years. Millions more would die. But the high water mark of Hitler's conquests had been reached in 1941, and the long retreat toward Berlin had begun.